Cheap labor has become a prevalent feature of the global economy, with companies seeking to cut costs by exploiting workers in developing countries. However, the hidden costs of cheap labor go far beyond the price tag of the goods we purchase. The human, environmental, economic, and social costs of cheap labor are often overlooked, but they have significant implications for workers, society, and the environment. In this video, we will explore the hidden costs of cheap labor and the impact of this practice on different aspects of our lives. We will discuss the exploitation of workers, the environmental degradation caused by industrialization, the impact on economic growth and development, and the social inequalities perpetuated by the demand for cheap labor. We will also examine potential solutions to this problem, including fair labor practices, corporate responsibility, consumer education, and government regulation. Cheap labor often comes at a high human cost, particularly for workers in developing countries. Workers are often subjected to low wages, poor working conditions, and long hours without adequate compensation. This exploitation can have serious health and safety consequences, with workers often exposed to dangerous chemicals, toxins, and unsafe machinery in factories and production facilities. In some cases, workers are forced to work in conditions that violate basic human rights, such as child labor and forced labor practices. In addition, cheap labor practices can have a devastating impact on worker rights and unionization efforts. Companies often seek to prevent workers from organizing or speaking out against poor working conditions, using tactics such as intimidation, harassment, and violence. This makes it difficult for workers to advocate for themselves and negotiate for better wages and working conditions, perpetuating the cycle of exploitation and abuse. The human cost of cheap labor extends beyond the workers themselves, affecting their families and communities as well. Low wages and poor working conditions can have a ripple effect on the health and well-being of families, particularly those who rely on a single breadwinner. The lack of opportunities for upward mobility can also create a sense of hopelessness and desperation, leading to social and economic instability. Ultimately, the human cost of cheap labor is unacceptable and unsustainable. It is important for companies to prioritize fair labor practices and ethical sourcing, recognizing that workers are not merely a means to an end but valuable members of society who deserve dignity, respect, and fair compensation for their labor. Cheap labor practices also have significant environmental costs. Industrialization and the pursuit of low-cost production can lead to environmental degradation, pollution, and resource depletion. In many cases, production facilities in developing countries operate with minimal environmental regulations, leading to unchecked emissions and waste disposal. The impact of cheap labor on sustainable development and environmental protection is a significant concern. Many companies that rely on cheap labor for production are contributing to greenhouse gas emissions and exacerbating climate change. Additionally, the disposal of waste and pollution from these facilities can contaminate soil and water supplies, posing significant risks to public health and environmental sustainability. Furthermore, the environmental impact of cheap labor is often felt disproportionately by communities of color and low-income communities. In many cases, production facilities are located in or near these communities, leading to greater exposure to environmental hazards and pollution. This creates a vicious cycle of environmental injustice and social inequality. It is imperative that companies prioritize sustainable development and environmental protection in their production processes, recognizing the critical importance of responsible environmental stewardship for the health and well-being of people and the planet. This means adopting environmentally responsible practices, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, minimizing waste, and respecting the communities in which they operate. While cheap labor may appear to be a cost-effective solution for companies, it can have significant long-term economic costs. The exploitation of workers and the environmental degradation caused by cheap labor practices can ultimately hinder economic growth and development. Exploitation of workers can lead to decreased productivity, low morale, and high turnover rates. This can lead to increased costs associated with recruitment, training, and loss of institutional knowledge. In addition, worker exploitation can lead to increased healthcare costs and social welfare expenditures, which ultimately burden the public sector. The environmental degradation caused by cheap labor practices can also have significant economic costs. The depletion of natural resources, pollution of land and water, and climate change can lead to significant costs associated with environmental remediation and mitigation. Furthermore, environmental degradation can lead to decreased agricultural yields, healthcare costs, and damage to infrastructure, which ultimately impact economic growth and development. Moreover, cheap labor practices can also lead to increased income inequality and decreased purchasing power, which can ultimately harm the economy. When workers are paid low wages, they have less disposable income to spend on goods and services, ultimately reducing demand for products and leading to decreased economic growth. In the long run, the economic cost of cheap labor practices can ultimately undermine economic growth and development, leading to increased poverty and social inequality. It is important for companies to recognize the long-term economic costs of cheap labor practices and prioritize fair labor practices, sustainable development, and environmental protection. By adopting responsible production practices, companies can support economic growth and development while also promoting social and environmental justice. The hidden costs of cheap labor demand ethical considerations from individuals, corporations, and governments. The exploitation of workers, environmental degradation, and economic costs associated with cheap labor practices are unacceptable and unsustainable. It is crucial that individuals prioritize ethical consumption and support companies that prioritize fair labor practices, sustainable development, and environmental protection. This means being aware of where products are sourced from, researching company practices, and advocating for change through consumer choices. Companies also have a responsibility to prioritize ethical sourcing and production processes. This means adopting fair labor practices, prioritizing sustainable development, and implementing environmentally responsible practices. Companies can also collaborate with governments and civil society organizations to advocate for ethical labor policies and regulations. Governments have a responsibility to regulate and enforce labor and environmental standards, ensuring that companies operate ethically and sustainably. This means developing and enforcing regulations that protect workers' rights, ensure fair compensation and working conditions, and promote sustainable development and environmental protection. Moreover, collaboration among individuals, corporations, and governments is necessary to create lasting solutions to the hidden costs of cheap labor. This means developing partnerships to address the root causes of exploitation and environmental degradation, and advocating for policies that promote social and environmental justice. The hidden costs of cheap labor are significant and multifaceted, encompassing the exploitation of workers, environmental degradation, and economic costs. These costs have implications not only for the affected individuals and communities but for the global economy and environment as well. It is crucial that individuals, corporations, and governments prioritize ethical consumption, production, and regulation to address the root causes of these costs. Ethical consumption involves being aware of where products are sourced from, researching company practices, and advocating for change through consumer choices. Ethical production involves adopting fair labor practices, prioritizing sustainable development, and implementing environmentally responsible practices. Ethical regulation involves developing and enforcing regulations that protect workers' rights, ensure fair compensation and working conditions, and promote sustainable development and environmental protection. Inaction is not an option. The long-term economic and environmental costs of cheap labor practices are unsustainable and unacceptable. It is our collective responsibility to promote social and environmental justice and ensure a sustainable future for all. We must recognize the interconnectedness of our world and take action to address the hidden costs of cheap labor. By doing so, we can create a more equitable and sustainable future for ourselves, our communities, and our planet.